The quiet morning in Sacramento was shattered by the harsh sound of a gavel, a sound usually associated with order, but on this day, it foreshadowed Judge Edward Chen's impending downfall. What he anticipated as a routine day of presiding over cases quickly turned into a public spectacle, his own arrogant words sealing his fate. This explosive moment unleashed a torrent of hidden wrongdoings spanning a decade, culminating in the once powerful judge being led away in handcuffs. The sterile courtroom, typically a fortress of judicial monotony, pulsated with an unusual energy. The case, involving allegations of racial profiling by the city's transit police, was significant but not usually newsworthy. Yet, everything teetered on the brink of irreversible change. Unexpectedly, Representative Jasmine Crocket appeared. Dressed in a commanding Navy suit, she exuded an understated strength, a quality often overlooked. Her presence wasn't for show. She was there because Trayson Wallace, the 18-year-old plaintiff at the heart of the case, had desperately asked her to come. He had endured a humiliating stop and detention at a light rail station, accused of matching a description that remained maddeningly vague. The night before, Jasmine had meticulously reviewed the police report 3 times, a profound unease unsettling her, a deep conviction that something was fundamentally wrong. She took a seat near the front, behind the plaintiff's table, but Judge Chen barely acknowledged her. Minutes into the hearing, the city's attorney made a calculated move, attempting to discredit a crucial witness. Jasmine subtly shifted, her pen moving with silent, furious intent as she scribbled a note and calmly slid it to the young lawyer representing the Wallace family. This quiet, defiant exchange snared Judge Chen's attention. Then it happened. Leaning forward, his voice dripping with condescension, Judge Chen's words echoed through the hushed gallery. "Ma'am, if you want to play lawyer, you could take the bar like the rest of us." The room didn't gasp. It froze, a heavy, pregnant pause. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the silence hang, stretched and heavy, for a beat longer than comfortable. Her face remained an unreadable mask. Then, with slow, deliberate grace, she rose. Her voice, calm yet cutting, resonated through the stunned courtroom. "Your Honor, I took the bar in Texas over 15 years ago. And I passed it twice, actually. I'm a sitting congresswoman with a law degree from UCLA, and I've served on both sides of courtroom. If you have a personal issue with my presence, say it. Otherwise, don't try to shrink me in front of these young people. They deserve better than that." Chen blinked, then stared down at his papers, as if seeking an escape. But there was none. A low murmur, a barely perceptible ripple of dissent, spread through the room. Someone in the back whispered. She said what needed to be said. Phones began to glow, recording. Jasmine remained standing, a silent, unwavering sentinel. Chen cleared his throat, a pathetic attempt to dismiss the moment, muttering, "Let's return to the matter at hand," already gesturing to the next agenda item. But the room hadn't moved on. A young reporter subtly angled his phone higher. A grandmother in the second row clutched her purse, knuckles white. The Wallace family attorney held her breath, transfixed. Jasmine stood upright, arms folded, not pleading for an apology, but refusing to relinquish the moment. In that suspended instant, nothing that followed seemed to matter. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a profound, fundamental realignment that compelled everyone in that courtroom, especially the young, to sit straighter, to truly grasp what it meant when someone utterly refused to be diminished. Even Judge Chen saw it. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. But no one, not even the most astute observer, could have foreseen the chilling revelation about to enter the courtroom. Just 3 days prior, Jasmine Crocket had been sitting on a folding chair in a packed community center in Stockton, the air thick with the hum of fluorescent lights. Her blazer draped over her seat. Her purpose then was not to speak, but to listen. Eunice Bratcher, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher, held the microphone, her voice thin with exhaustion, trembling as she spoke. "This isn't just about one boy getting stopped at a train station," she asserted, her words gaining quiet power. This judge, he's been pushing people around in silence for years, dismissing cases without blinking, rolling his eyes when we show up with our church clothes on, like we're wasting his time. Jasmine's gaze drifted to Trayson Wallace, perched on the edge of a folding table, his knee bouncing with restless energy. His public defender had offered him little hope, whispering that the courts weren't built for boys like him. But Jasmine was writing, name after name, stories unfolding before her. She didn't yet need absolute proof. She needed patterns. And the patterns, unsettling and clear, all pointed to one name, Judge Edward Chen. She didn't know him personally, had never argued a case in his courtroom. Yet, as she began discreet inquiries, she uncovered a disquieting rhythm. Cases dismissed on technicalities, plaintiffs interrupted mid-testimony, warnings issued for speaking out of turn, even when directly answering questions. And always, the same insidious energy, the same condescending tone, whenever certain people were involved. The word disrespect echoed in her ears again and again. It clung to her not just as a problem, but as a subtle, insidious weapon. You couldn't always prove it. It left no paper trail, but you felt it deep in your bones. And Jasmine, having lived long enough, recognized when something had deep, hidden roots. By Sunday evening, nestled in a quiet Lodi coffee shop, she found it, a sealed complaint filed under a former city employee's name. The notation was unmistakable: judicial misconduct, buried, snarled in procedural delays for over a year. She couldn't access the document itself, but the chilling implication was clear. She hadn't walked into that Sacramento courtroom blind on Tuesday. She carried a profound conviction that this hearing, this seemingly insignificant case, might pry open something far larger, far more rotten. She wasn't merely there for moral support. She was there to listen, to validate the unsettling instincts that had guided her. What she hadn't anticipated, however, was for the judge himself to deliver the damning proof so swiftly, so publicly, so irrevocably on the record. The cruel irony of men like Edward Chen was their inability to conceal their true nature once they had operated unchecked for so long. It seeped out, in their tone, in their presumptions, in the contempt with which they treated those who refused to shrink. And when that poison leaked out in front of the right person, on the right day, it transcended a mere pattern. It became an undeniable problem, one that could no longer be swept away. The hearing Jasmine attended was meant to be one step in a prolonged legal process. No final ruling was anticipated. But the instant that comment was uttered, the courtroom ceased to be just a room. It transformed into a window, and for the first time in years, someone with both power and a memory stood on the other side of it. What Jasmine didn't know was that she wasn't the only one keeping records. Unbeknownst to her, one such record had already found its way into the hands of the Justice Department. Years prior, a local attorney named Gavin O'Shea had attempted to file a misconduct complaint against Judge Chen. Gavin, one of the few black attorneys practicing regularly in Sacramento's federal courthouse, had represented Belinda Norris, a single mother whose son was ensnared in a sweep during a high school protest. The charges, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, were flimsy, yet Judge Chen had summarily dismissed her complaint before the facts could be fully presented. Following the hearing, Gavin meticulously filed paperwork detailing inconsistent treatment of witnesses and the repeated dismissal of procedural protections when applied to minority litigants. It vanished into the bureaucratic abyss. No formal response, no acknowledgement. Merely a quiet, chilling message whispered through court staff: "He's a federal judge. Good luck." The chilling message spread like wildfire among attorneys in the area. You don't push Chen. You work around him. You prep your clients differently. You brace for interruptions. You didn't expect eye contact or fairness. You hoped for efficiency and prayed he didn't take anything personally. Jasmine Crocket had heard whispers of this long before she ever set foot in that courtroom. During her clerkship in Texas, she had seen judges like him, powerful men in pressed robes who prioritized courtroom decorum over fundamental dignity. The kind who mistakenly equated confidence with arrogance, especially when it emanated from someone who looked like her. When she had confided in Gavin during a hushed phone call the night before the hearing, he hadn't held back. "Look," he'd said, his voice grim, "he doesn't throw chairs or scream, but I've had clients leave that courtroom in tears. Not because they lost, but because they weren't even treated like people." Jasmine had written that down too, and Gavin wasn't alone. Over the preceding months, a slow, steady trickle of complaints had begun to land on the desks of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. Stephanie Keene, a vigilant paralegal who worked with one of the community law clinics, meticulously compiled them. She possessed copies of dockets, video clips, and even statements from a court stenographer who claimed Judge Chen frequently struck comments from the record that revealed his impatience or bias. Most of these complaints have been dismissed, buried, or ignored. Until now, the hearing Jasmine attended had already raised red flags due to the intense press interest surrounding Trayson Wallace's case. But it was Jasmine's unexpected presence and Chen's incandescent reaction to it that detonated everything. When Jasmine calmly, cuttingly, responded to his insult, the moment went explosively viral within hours. Someone posted the courtroom video to X, formerly Twitter, the caption a defiant roar. "This is why we show up." Judge thought she'd be quiet. She wasn't. Within minutes, lawyers from across the country were commenting, "We've seen this before. This isn't new. Same thing happened in Fresno last year." The hashtag Chen Courtroom began trending by 6 p.m. And behind the furious online buzz, someone at the DOJ made a pivotal call. The internal database, now meticulously scrutinized, revealed a chilling truth. A consistent trail of procedural oddities in Judge Chen's courtroom stretching back nearly a decade. Denials of motions to compel evidence. Frequent warnings issued disproportionately to Black or Latino plaintiffs. Repeated interruptions meticulously logged in transcripts. The more they searched, the more they found. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't physically assaulted anyone. But Judge Chen had left indelible marks. Jasmine didn't grasp the full, terrifying scope of what was brewing behind the scenes, but she could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet. You don't stand up in a federal courtroom, challenge a judge on the record, and walk away without some kind of consequence. But what she didn't expect was that the consequence wasn't coming for her. It was coming for him. The morning after the hearing, a federal marshal named Eric McConnell received a sealed order to appear in Chen's courtroom under full legal authority should intervention become necessary. McConnell had never been ordered to enter an active hearing with a body camera rolling. He charged the battery that night, concealing the lens beneath the front button of his jacket. But it wasn't just the marshal who came prepared. The people watching from the gallery had endured for years, silently yearning to witness someone finally stand up to that bench. Judge Chen believed he had moved on. The courtroom was back in session. He spoke in clipped phrases, his gaze skittering away from everyone, especially Jasmine Crocket. But the very air in the room had shifted. The oppressive weight of his earlier remarks still hung, unaddressed, undeniable. Everyone could feel it. Jasmine did not immediately reclaim her seat. She remained standing for a few extra seconds, just long enough to amplify the profound silence. Then, slowly, with an unreadable expression, she lowered herself back into her seat. The hearing stumbled forward. Amira Denton, the Wallace family's attorney, began reading from her notes, clearly rattled by the preceding exchange. Her voice trembled slightly as she questioned the arresting officer. Judge Chen demanded the officer speak up, his tone now sharper, less controlled. In the third row, Stephanie Keene, the vigilant paralegal who had meticulously compiled the earlier misconduct reports, kept her phone face down on her lap, camera still recording. She wasn't breaking any laws. California courtrooms did not ban personal recordings unless the judge explicitly forbade it. He hadn't, and Jasmine knew it. That was why she had been so deliberate, so calm, so devoid of anger. She knew people were watching, not just those in the room, but those who would witness the footage later, people who had been silenced in countless rooms just like this one. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about power, about control. Across from her, Judge Chen nervously flipped through his legal pad, his fingers fumbling. His voice was slightly hoarse when he finally interrupted the proceedings again. "Congresswoman Crocker," he stated, without lifting his head, "I'd ask that you refrain from future interjections during formal questioning." Jasmine glanced around the room before responding. "I haven't interrupted anything, Your Honor," she stated plainly. "But I'll remain silent unless you decide to comment on my qualifications again." A low chuckle rippled from the back of the room. Chen looked up sharply but remained silent, merely gesturing for Amira to continue. But Amira paused. "Actually, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "we'd like to introduce a brief exhibit. We have body cam footage of Mr. Wallace's detainment, submitted to the court last Friday." Chen's expression tightened with annoyance. "I wasn't notified of any supplemental video footage," he snapped. "It was sent through your clerk," Amira calmly countered, "and time-stamped with receipt. Would you like to recess and review it now?" A loaded pause hung in the air. Then Judge Chen leaned back in his chair, nodding slightly. 5-minute recess. The instant he stood, the back door swung open. Federal Marshal Eric McConnell entered the room, a silent, imposing figure. He carried a folder tucked under one arm and a sealed brown envelope in the other. No announcement, no drawn weapons. He walked directly to the bailiff and handed him the envelope. The bailiff stiffened as he read it, then wordlessly carried it to the judge's bench. Chen was still poring over the document when the marshal turned, faced Jasmine, and gave her the faintest, almost imperceptible nod, the silent signal that the first domino had finally toppled. In the gallery, phones materialized instantly, people whispering, daring not to speak too loudly. This was not normal. Marshals did not walk into courtrooms like this, not without a compelling reason, not during a recess. Chen looked up from the envelope, his expression transformed. Less irritation, more a chilling calculation. He cleared his throat. "We'll reconvene in 10 minutes, he announced, but he did not move. Neither did the marshal. And Jasmine, she crossed her legs, leaned back, and folded her hands in her lap. She needed to say nothing else. The mic was on. The cameras were rolling. The judge had officially lost control of his own courtroom. But what no one knew, what no one could have possibly predicted, was that the sealed document didn't merely list past complaints. It meticulously detailed potential federal charges. 10 minutes stretched into 15, then 20. Still, no one moved. Judge Chen remained behind the bench, desperately scanning the sealed document again, as if the words might magically transform with a second glance. But they didn't, and Marshal McConnell didn't budge. His position was deliberate, half a step back from the bench, directly in line with the judge's exit route. The courtroom hadn't emptied during the recess. In fact, more people had slipped in, drawn by the urgent rumors spiraling through the courthouse corridors. Someone had already posted a grainy image online. Chen with the document in hand, the marshal a silent, looming presence behind him, the caption screaming, "Everything. Reckoning on 4th Street." Inside, the energy was dense, tightly controlled. Everyone knew something momentous was unfolding, but no one yet grasped the terrifying scope of it. The Wallace family sat huddled near the front, Amira Denton whispering something to Trace Hahn, who had remained utterly silent since the break began. Jasmine remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on Chen's every micro-movement, like a chess grandmaster tracking a weary opponent. Finally, the judge spoke. "This court is now in recess until further notice. All parties may remain in the courtroom if they wish, but this hearing will not resume today." The gallery stirred, a few people beginning to rise. But Marshal McConnell raised a hand, a respectful, yet firm, gesture. "Your Honor, I have instructions to speak with you privately, immediately." Chen looked at him, as though he might argue, but didn't. Instead, he muttered something to the bailiff and began gathering his papers. That's when the second marshal entered. Deputy Vanessa Reagan, in plain clothes but with a badge clipped to her belt, emerged from the back of the room, carrying a body-worn camera and a stack of folders. She said nothing, merely nodded to McConnell, then positioned herself near the jury box, a silent, unyielding blockade to any potential exit from that side of the room. Chen froze. Judge Edward Chen. McConnell stated evenly, his voice devoid of emotion. You are under federal investigation for judicial misconduct, willful suppression of legal process, and obstruction of justice. You are not under arrest at this moment. However, I have orders to detain you if you refuse to comply with this investigation or attempt to leave the premises. Gasps erupted. A chair scraped across the floor. The Wallace family's youngest daughter let out a quiet, shocked what? Chen stood perfectly still for a moment, appearing as though he might simply ignore the marshals and push through. But the unyielding stance of Reagan, the slow, deliberate movement of McConnell as he closed in, it became horrifyingly clear that there was nowhere left to go. He attempted to maintain an even tone. This is ridiculous. If someone has a complaint, there are procedures. There were procedures, McConnell calmly countered, and they were buried. You were notified about 3 of them. 2 others were sealed by your own clerk. That's not how the system is supposed to work. Cameras were already up, phone lights flashed. The courtroom, once a quiet, neutral space, had been transformed into a stark, unforgiving stage. And Chen, once the man with the gavel, stood alone in the blinding spotlight, desperately attempting to explain why the rules should not apply to him. I have years of experience. I've served faithfully, he barked, his voice cracking. You're going to embarrass a sitting judge on a hunch. McConnell didn't flinch. This isn't a hunch. It's a pattern, and we have the paperwork to prove it. The word struck harder than anyone had anticipated. In that raw moment, Chen's face contorted, his arrogance shattering, replaced by something else entirely. Not guilt, not shame, but pure, unadulterated fear. He looked at Jasmine Crocket, who remained unmoving. She did not smile, did not gloat. She merely met his eyes and held them, silently, unflinchingly. You need to come with us now, McConnell stated when Chen remained unresponsive. Reagan stepped forward. If you refuse, we'll place you in federal custody right here. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue again, but the moment passed. His shoulders slumped. Quietly, he placed his glasses on the bench and extended his hands. Reagan produced a small pair of cuffs, slim, professional, not designed to humiliate, yet the symbolism was unmistakable. As she locked them in place, someone in the back whispered, "It's really happening." And it was. Chen was led through the side door, flanked by the 2 marshals, while every phone in the room followed his retreating steps. But outside the courtroom, an entirely different scene was building, and they were hungrily awaiting answers. When the courtroom door closed behind Judge Chen, a heavy silence descended. Nobody stood up, not right away. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to shatter the spell, to speak, to move first. But the stillness now possessed a profound weight. This was no longer merely about one man in handcuffs, but about the terrifying, uncertain implications of what came next. Jasmine Crocket remained seated, her arms resting lightly on her knees, her gaze fixed on the closed door, as if it might swing back open at any moment. Around her, the gallery began to hum softly, people speaking in hushed voices, still unsure whether they had just witnessed justice or the terrifying genesis of something far more complicated. Then, Amira Ditton spoke, not to anyone in particular, but just loud enough for the room to hear. Well, that just happened. Laughter, short, nervous, profoundly real, rippled through the space, shattering the tension like a hammer striking glass. A few people exhaled sharply, others chuckled quietly. Even Jasmine allowed herself a small, mirthless shake of the head. But the atmosphere did not remain light for long. Someone near the back of the room stood up, demanding, "Hey, is this real? I mean, is this for show? Or is he really being charged?" It was Stephanie Keene who answered. She had stepped out to make a quick call and had just returned. "It's real," she stated, her voice steady. "The DOJ filed preliminary charges yesterday. Today was the confirmation order. They were just waiting on a public incident to execute it." A pause followed, pregnant with implications. "Wait," another voice cut in. "You're telling me they knew this was coming? Why didn't they say anything before?" Jasmine finally rose to her feet. "They did," she asserted. "They said it in sealed documents. They said it in interviews no one read. They said it in complaints that never got traction. But folks like Judge Chen, they know how to keep things quiet until someone refuses to let it go quiet. That landed heavy. She looked around the room, at the Wallace family, at the reporters frantically scrambling to capture reactions, at the older individuals in the second and third rows who hadn't moved from their spots since the hearing began. You all saw it. Jasmine continued, her voice gaining power, and now you have to decide what to do with it. Because if they only move when there's a camera in the room, then we better make sure the cameras never turn off. She grabbed her satchel, nodded once to Amira, and stepped into the hallway without a backward glance. It took a few seconds, but one by one, people followed. First Trason and his family, then the rest of the gallery. By the time the last person stepped out, the courtroom was empty. In the hallway, the mood had transformed, louder, more electric. TV crews had assembled in front of the courthouse within 20 minutes of the news breaking. Reporters, clad in jackets, clutched microphones, pushing in towards anyone who looked like they had just emerged from inside. Activists waved hand-painted signs. Some chanted, others stood quietly, patiently waiting for Jasmine to speak. She didn't at first. Instead, she moved to the courthouse steps and stood beside Trason Wallace. His hand trembled as he reached for the mic, but he didn't pull back. "I came in here thinking nobody'd believe me," he began, his voice surprisingly steady. "That even with the videos, even with my mama showing up, even with the lawyers, we'd still get ignored." He glanced at Jasmine, but somebody spoke up. And now, I guess it's not just me anymore. That was when the crowd truly reacted, not with noise, but with an almost reverent attention. Phones rose, faces turned, people leaned in, not because of who was speaking, but because of what was finally being said. And Jasmine, she simply listened. But even outside those courthouse doors, the fight was far from over, for there were still names missing from the record and stories that had never made it to the bench. Outside the courthouse, it was no longer just a crowd. It was a gathering that felt profoundly like a reckoning. The sidewalks swelled with voices, with camera flashes, with protest signs that hadn't been hastily constructed, but pulled from closets, dusted off, reused, because this was not the first time people had risen to fight the system. It just might have been the first time they witnessed it crack in real time. Some chanted, but not everyone needed to make noise. A woman in her 60s stood at the edge of the steps with a sign that read, "Believe us the first time." She did not wave it. She simply held it chest high, staring straight ahead, as if daring anyone to look away. Media vans lined the curb. Every major outlet had scrambled to get a reporter on site. Some were broadcasting live, others frantically attempting to verify what had just transpired. Inside, Judge Chen had been whisked away to a holding room, pending transfer. Outside, the very people he had ignored for years stood under the sun and spoke his name, loud, clear, and utterly without fear. Jasmine Crocket stood near the barricades, arms crossed, observing it all. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't giving interviews. She was simply watching the moment settle in, the immense weight of it, the profound chaos that stemmed not from disorder, but from chilling clarity. Next to her, a reporter called out, "Congresswoman Crocket, do you believe Judge Chen's removal will actually lead to lasting change?" She turned slowly to face him. "That depends," she stated, her voice even. "Are you going to run the full story? Or just the part where he got let out in cuffs?" Another voice from the other side of the barricade chimed in. "Are the charges real? Or is this political theater?" Jasmine didn't flinch. What's political about a judge with a 10-year pattern of discrimination? You think the facts change because someone finally hit record. Behind her, Amira Denton joined the circle. She stepped forward and added, "What you saw today didn't start this morning. This has been going on for years. What happened and there was justice catching up. Slowly, painfully, but it caught up." The crowd shifted again. More people were arriving. A group of college students from UC Davis held a banner that read, "Equal courts, not silent ones." A middle-aged man in work boots lifted his toddler onto his shoulders just to see over the heads. And then, through the buzz and clatter of camera shutters, came a new wave of voices. Former plaintiffs, people who had once stood before Judge Chen and walked away with nothing, but paperwork and profound frustration. One woman, Ramona Fielding, stepped forward in her early 40s, a red scarf tied around her head. She held up an envelope. "This is the dismissal from my housing discrimination case," she said to no one in particular. She cut off my testimony after 8 minutes, told me my emotions were clouding the facts. But the facts were all I had. Someone handed her a microphone. The crowd listened, hushed. That was 5 years ago. I didn't think anyone would ever care. I stopped going to hearings. I stopped fighting. Her voice cracked. But today I saw something I never thought I'd see. And it made me feel like maybe I wasn't crazy. Heads turned, cameras zoomed in. Beside her, a teenager in a black hoodie stepped forward. I tried to report a case about school discipline bias. Got laughed out of the courtroom. He told my mom to stop wasting everyone's time. We never came back. His voice trembled. He was shaking, but he didn't stop talking. Another woman, older, tall with a slow gait, moved towards Jasmine. I filed 3 times. I gave up each 1 inch. Jasmine stepped toward her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not too late." The woman looked as though she might cry, but didn't. She simply nodded once and looked forward again. Everywhere Jasmine looked, someone was remembering, someone was speaking. It wasn't just about Judge Chen anymore. It was about everyone like him. People who wielded power quietly, who dismissed lies with a mere stroke of a pen, who assumed no one would ever fight back. But now that people were truly listening, the silence that had once protected injustice could no longer be trusted. By late afternoon, the courthouse had emptied. The crowd outside thinned, but didn't vanish. Small groups lingered on the lawn, talking in low voices, sharing stories they hadn't dared to utter aloud in years. It wasn't a protest anymore. It felt more like a profoundly delayed truth-telling session. Jasmine Crocket didn't leave either. She had retreated to one of the smaller conference rooms on the 2nd floor, away from the cameras and the noise, where she invited a few individuals to speak, just her and them, face to face. No reporters, no notes, just raw, unvarnished stories. The first to sit across from her was Ramona Fielding. She placed a worn manila envelope on the table. Jasmine didn't immediately reach for it. She waited. "I brought this the first time I testified," Ramona said, her fingers brushing the edges. Photos, rent receipts, text messages from the landlord filled with unrepeatable obscenities. "I gave the whole file to the clerk." Jasmine nodded once. Ramona looked down. He barely glanced at it. Asked me if I was angry when I wrote the complaint. Said I might have misread his tone. Ramona's voice grew distant. I told him I'd lived in that apartment for 9 years. Judge Chen said, "Then maybe it wasn't that bad." Silence. "What did you do next?" Jasmine finally asked. Ramona's eyes were weary. "I went back to work. Packed my things. I moved out in 3 weeks. Slept on my sister's couch for 5 months. I haven't trusted a courtroom since." She stood, thanked Jasmine, and left without waiting for a response. Next came Luis Calderon, a former college student who had filed a wrongful arrest suit 4 years prior. He sat down with a stiff, almost defensive posture. "He told me I should have known better." Luis began, his voice tight. "That I shouldn't have been out late wearing a hoodie. Said the officers had every right to question me. I asked if walking down my own block was suspicious, and he said, 'Well, it was late.'" Jasmine let out a slow breath. Luis continued, his words a torrent. "I was studying criminal justice, wanted to be a public defender. After that hearing, I dropped out. Couldn't sit in those classrooms anymore, knowing that's what was waiting on the other side." His voice cracked for a fleeting moment. Then he collected himself and added, "This isn't about revenge. I just want it to matter. You showing up today already made it matter." Jasmine replied softly. Then came a young woman named Jelia Price. She was barely 20 and looked as though she had aged a decade too soon. She hadn't come to the courthouse intending to speak, but after the hearing, someone had gently convinced her to come inside. She sat, arms folded, eyes flicking nervously around the room. "I filed for emancipation when I was 17, she said, her voice thin. "My stepfather had been abusive, but I didn't have bruises that day, just a diary and a counselor's statement." Chen asked me why I hadn't just waited it out. Jasmine frowned. Waited what out? Waited to turn 18, Jalaya explained. Said it would have saved the court time, like I was asking for too much. Jalaya blinked rapidly, but didn't cry. He denied the request. Sent me home. Told me to respect the process. Jasmine leaned forward. Where did you go after that? I left anyway, Jalaya said. Lived in a shelter. Got my GD. I didn't look back. But today, hearing his name on the news, I needed to see it. I needed to see him fall. Her hands clenched in her lap. I don't need him to apologize. I just want to stop feeling like I imagined it. Jasmine reached across the table, not to console her, but to hold space. You didn't imagine anything. You were just the wrong person in front of the wrong man with the wrong kind of power. The interviews continued for another hour. No cameras, no press conferences, just broken stories laid out on a government issue table, with a woman who had finally compelled someone to listen. By the time she walked back into the hallway, most of the building had cleared out. Amira stood waiting near the exit. She handed Jasmine her coat and said quietly, "How do you carry all of that?" Jasmine didn't look up as she answered, "You don't. You pass it on, so the next girl doesn't have to." But across the country, more courtrooms were running on borrowed silence, and someone had just cracked open the first one. The next morning, headlines stretched coast to coast. Some were cautious, federal judge under scrutiny for alleged misconduct. Others didn't hold back. Judge removed mid-hearing after public showdown with Congresswoman. But none of them truly captured what it had felt like to be in that room, to witness power irrevocably shift, not because someone demanded it, but because someone simply refused to be silent. At 9 a.m., the Department of Justice held a press briefing. The spokesperson, at first, avoided naming Judge Chen directly, speaking in practiced tones, citing a pattern of inconsistent judicial conduct and credible claims of racial bias across multiple cases. But when pressed by a reporter, she confirmed what everyone already knew. Yes, the preliminary investigation centers around Judge Edward Chen and a series of complaints dating back more than 10 years. She paused, then added, "The court system relies on public trust. That trust was compromised." That same morning, Jasmine Crocket walked into a local church rec center in West Sacramento. No cameras, no security detail, just folding chairs, paper cups of weak coffee, and residents who had never felt seen by the courts. She greeted people by name, sat down, and listened. The topic was no longer just Chen. It was bigger than him. People were talking about their own judges, their own hearings, their own cases that had never made it past the first filing. What had happened in that courtroom had lit a fuse. At a side table, an older man named Douglas Pruitt asked a question that hung heavy in the air. What happens now? I mean, for all the folks that didn't get their day, Jasmine didn't rush to answer. "We don't get to redo the past," she said, "but we do get to document it. We get to name it. We get to make sure it doesn't happen again." Someone asked if that meant reopening old cases. Some, yes, Jasmine replied, and others, maybe it just means giving people the chance to finally be heard. Back in Washington, a ripple effect had already begun. Judges with long-standing complaints against them were being flagged. Law clerks were being interviewed. Ethics boards that had once gathered dust were now being revitalized. And the footage of Judge Chen being escorted out, calm, stunned, in handcuffs, played over and over again. Not because people craved revenge, but because they desperately sought confirmation that the system was not immune to accountability. Even in Chen's absence, the courtroom where it had happened had changed. People who returned for hearings in the days that followed noticed subtle shifts. More transparency, less eye-rolling, fewer interruptions. Judges were making eye contact. Bailiffs were being patient. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. And for the Wallace family, it meant something even more tangible. A federal review of Trescian's arrest was announced. His case was no longer just local, but part of a broader examination into systemic profiling. His attorney, Amira Denton, was tapped to join a DOJ task force reviewing racial bias in municipal courts. "I didn't come here to change the world," Amira said during a small press huddle. "I just wanted my client to be treated like a person. But if that opens doors for others, I'll keep walking through them." Meanwhile, Jasmine was already preparing her next move. Not a press tour, not a campaign speech, but a congressional proposal. Mandatory annual reviews for federal judges with documented misconduct complaints, independent panels, no internal shielding, real consequences. Reporters persistently asked her if this was personal. Her answer never wavered. It should be personal for all of us. She wasn't seeking to become a hero. She simply refused to let silence win anymore. And the people who had lived through it, the people who had left courtrooms like Chen's with their dignity in tatters, were finally standing tall again. But there was still one last, crucial story to tell, for some names do not fade when the headlines recede. Some become lessons etched into law. 3 weeks later, the sign outside the federal courthouse on H Street was subtly altered. Not the name of the building itself, but a small plaque near the entrance that listed the sitting judges. Edward Chen's name was gone. Inside, Courtroom 2B had resumed normal hearings. Different cases, different people. But something lingered in the air now, as if the room itself held a memory, and everyone who stepped into it could feel its silent weight. The Wallace case was still active, but it had already become part of something far larger. Federal oversight had arrived in Sacramento. Policies that had once seemed untouchable were being rewritten. Community groups who used to meet in basements were now sitting at tables with state officials. And reporters were still calling Jasmine Crockett's office daily. She kept most of her answers concise, unwilling to transform a scandal into a mere spotlight. But she agreed to one final interview with Mara DeWitt, an independent journalist who had meticulously followed the story since its first explosive day. They met at a cafe. No makeup, no press team, just 2 women and a table by the window. "You didn't hesitate," Mara observed. "You could have stayed quiet, let slide. Judges say worse things every day, and no one bats an eye." Jasmine stirred her coffee, her eyes steady. "It wasn't about what he said," she clarified. "It was about who was watching when he said it. That courtroom had kids in it, families, people who've been told their whole lives to keep their heads down. If I didn't say something, I'd be telling them he was right." Mara leaned in. "And now that he's gone, what's next?" Jasmine didn't answer immediately. "Then, I don't want him to be the headline. I want what happened in that room to be the reminder. The law doesn't work unless we stay awake. We all have a role to play, no matter what side of the bench we're on." That quote ran in a Sunday column under the stark headline. She refused to shrink. But Jasmine had already moved on. She had flown back to D.C. to relentlessly push forward her judicial review proposal. She took calls from small law offices in places like Fresno, Tallahassee, and Des Moines, attorneys who shared their own chilling stories, their own Judge Chens, but who had never found the courage, the right moment, to speak up. Now, they weren't just speaking, they were filing. Back in Sacramento, people still recounted what had transpired that day, like it was a cinematic event. "Were you there?" became a kind of badge of honor. Some had screenshots from the video saved to their phones. Others had nothing but the visceral memory of how profoundly quiet the room had become when truth, brutal and undeniable, cracked through the facade of power. And for the young ones, like Trayson Wallace, it became a pivotal turning point. He didn't just win his case. He began speaking at youth justice panels. He completed his high school diploma and enrolled at a local college to study political science. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. "Somebody told me I mattered," he said at a panel 6 months later, and after that, I started believing it. As for Judge Chen, his name slowly faded from the daily news. His trial was scheduled for the following year. Legal analysts debated the intricate specifics, but for the countless people who had stood before his bench and walked away feeling diminished, the verdict had already been irrevocably delivered. He was no longer untouchable. And Jasmine, she never uttered his name again. Not in interviews, not in speeches, not even when the cameras desperately begged for it. Because for her, it was never about a mere takedown. It was about profound accountability. It was about what it truly means to stand when it is infinitely easier to sit. It was about refusing to let injustice cloak itself in a robe and brazenly call itself order. She knew the fight was far from over. She knew more names would surface, more judges, more hearings, more silence to be shattered. But now, people were no longer afraid to speak. And the story of that one tumultuous day in courtroom 2B, where a woman stood tall, a judge fell hard, and the country witnessed it all unfold, would live on, not just as a headline, but as a chilling, potent warning. Power listens when people finally stop whispering. And for every person who had ever felt small in a courtroom, Jasmine Crocket had delivered one lasting, transformative truth. Your voice is not a favor. It is an undeniable right. So, if you're watching this and grappling with whether to speak up, to raise your hand, to call out what feels profoundly wrong, remember what happened here. And do not, under any circumstances, wait for permission. Say something. Источники.